In December 1811, in the heart of London's most dangerous street, an entire family was bludgeoned to death in their own shop, and the man England hanged for it may never have committed a single one of the murders. 20 minutes past midnight, Saturday the 7th of December, 1811, a servant girl named Margaret Jewell stood outside a locked door, knocking. She'd only been gone 25 minutes. Sent out for oysters of all things, just oysters. A late supper for her mistress, still weak from childbirth. She knocked harder. The baby inside, 14 weeks old, let out a single cry, then silence. When the neighbor finally broke down the back door, what he found inside was so savage, so utterly without reason, that the morning papers would declare it beyond the comprehension of civilized men. A family of 4 butchered, not robbed, not threatened, simply annihilated. And by the time a suspect was found, all of London had already decided the matter. The question was whether they were right. By the end of this investigation, you won't just know who the authorities blamed for the Ratcliff highway murders. You'll understand why the wrong man may have died for them. You'll see how 7 innocent people were failed, not once, not twice, but every single time a decision was made, by magistrates too frightened to look foolish, by a public too panicked to wait for truth, and by a justice system that had no real tools to find a killer. This is not just a murder case. This is the moment England looked into the face of violent crime and decided fear was easier than justice. Ratcliff Highway in 1811 was not a respectable address. It was the spine of East London's dockside underworld, a mile of tavern, pawnbrokers, sailors' lodging, and cheapjack shopfronts that reeked of tallow and river mud. Every nationality you could name lived shoulder to shoulder here. Irish labourers, Lascar sailors, Dutch merchants, German tradesmen, the sort of place where nobody asked too many questions and everybody owed somebody something. Timothy Marr was trying to build something better, 24 years old, former sailor for the East India Company, now a linen draper with a young wife, Celia, a 14-week-old son, an apprentice lad named James Gowan, and a servant girl in Margaret Jewell, a right proper household in the making, a family that had everything to live for. London in 1811 had no metropolitan police, no detective, no forensic. Crimes were investigated by parish constables who were, more often than not, elderly men paid in beer money. When blood was shed on Ratcliff Highway that December, what passed for justice was already behind before it had begun. But this was only the beginning of how badly it would fail. The night of Saturday, the 7th, began like any other on the highway. Shops lit from inside, the smell of coal smoke and salt. Timothy Marr still at his counter past 11, catching up on the week's accounts. He sent Margaret Jewell out for oysters at 1:45, a last treat for Celia. The baby was settled. She was gone less than 30 minutes. The Morning Chronicle, 9 December 1811. A most horrid and barbarous murder has been committed in Ratcliff Highway. A whole family has been cruelly butchered. The town is in the utmost state of consternation. When John Murray, pawnbroker, next-door neighbor, vaulted the back wall and entered through the open rear door, he was calling out cheerfully. He assumed they'd simply forgotten to latch the shutters. He found James Gowan first, the apprentice, 14 years old. His skull had been staved in so violently that his brains had been thrown across the counter and onto the far wall. Celia Marr lay in the hallway, face down. Still bleeding, Timothy Marr was behind his own counter, battered dead. Murray ran upstairs. In the crib, the infant lay silent. His head had been nearly severed. He was 14 weeks old. Nothing had been taken. The till was full. £152 sat untouched in the bedroom drawer. This was not robbery. This was something else entirely. The weapon found at the scene was a heavy shipwright's maul, a long-handled hammer used for driving nails into timber, blood-soaked, leaning calmly against a bedroom chair, as if placed there deliberately, and scratched into its wooden handle were 2 initials. JP, remember those 2 letters, They will matter more than anyone realized, but not in the way the investigators assumed. 3 sailors found loitering nearby were dragged to the station. 1 had blood on his coat. All 3 were released by morning, solid alibis, everyone. The case had no suspect, no motive, and the city was beginning to shake. In the 12 days following the Marr murders, London did not sleep. Magistrates offered 50 guineas reward. Handbills were nailed to church doors. Every man on the highway with a dodgy past was looked at twice. And then on Thursday, the 19th of December, the very night investigators cleaned the mall and finally noticed the initials JP. Carved into the handle, the killer struck again. Testimony of John Williamson, hours before his death, given to a parish constable. There is a fellow in a brown jacket who has been lurking about my door, listening. I wish you would keep an eye for him. If you see him loitering, take him in. John Williamson ran the King's Arms Tavern on New Gravel Lane, 56 years old, a man who had kept a respectable house for 15 years. His wife Elizabeth was 60. Their servant Bridget Harrington was in her late 50s that same night. A lodger named John Turner woke to find himself stepping over a body in the hall. He knotted his bedsheets into a rope and lowered himself, half naked and screaming, from an upstairs window into the street below. John Turner, to the crowd gathered below, December 1811. Murder. They are all murdered in there. The old man, his wife, they are all done for. God help us. Crowd forced the doors. John Williamson lay dying on the cellar stairs, his skull fractured, his leg broken. Elizabeth was already dead in the kitchen. Bridget Harrington lay nearby, bludgeoned. A young girl, the Williamsons' granddaughter, who had been lodging there, was found unharmed upstairs, asleep. The killer had passed her door and chosen not to enter. That detail would haunt the investigators. Why spare one and destroy the others? By morning, London was in a state of mass terror unlike anything since the Gordon riots. Shops shuttered. Women refused to be left alone. The Bow Street runners were overwhelmed. Militia units were quietly put on standby. Magistrate Aaron Graham, letter to the Home Secretary, December 1811. The public mind is in a state of the most violent agitation. Every person in the neighborhood goes in terror of their life. We must be seen to act, and act swiftly. And there it was, the fatal instruction, not find the right man. Be seen to act. What happened next would make this investigation far more dangerous. The initials JP carved into the mall gave investigators their first solid lead. Traced through the dockside tool trade, the mall was identified as belonging to a man called John P., a Swedish sailor who had left it behind at a lodging house on Pennington Street. That lodging house was the Pear Tree Public House, and among its current lodgers was a man named John William. Williams was 27, Irish-born, a seaman with the look of someone who'd been everywhere and settled nowhere. He'd known Timothy Marr. They'd served together briefly on the same ship years before. He had no firm alibi for either night of the killings, and one of the other lodgers claimed to have seen blood on his stocking on the morning of the 8th of December. Within days, Williams was the only name anyone in London was speaking. Core blimey. The mob outside the jail was already baying for blood before the magistrate even drawn up a charge. The Times, 24 December 1811. The wretch who perpetrated these horrible atrocities is now in custody. He is described as a man of genteel appearance, a circumstance which renders his guilt proved still more execrable. But the evidence was astonishingly thin. The blood on his stocking, if it was blood at all, had disappeared by the time anyone examined it properly. The mall had belonged to not Williams. Williams had merely lodged in the same house. The single witness who claimed to have seen him near the Marr premises that night gave a shaky account, full of contradiction. Here is what nobody in that January of 1812 was asking loudly enough. If Williams used a mall from the common storage of a shared lodging house, why would he bother returning it? And if he didn't return it, why was it found at the scene at all? But the open loop, those initials JP, was still turning, because the investigators had made an assumption about what they meant, and that assumption was about to unravel everything. On the 27th of December, 1811, John Williams was found dead in his cell at Coldbath Fields Prison. He had hanged himself, or so the jailers said. Using his own handkerchief and the bar of his window, he left no note, no confession, no last words, and immediately the authorities declared the matter closed. London erupted, not in relief, but in fury, because a dead man cannot be questioned, a dead man cannot be tried, a dead man cannot be proved guilty. He is simply gone, and his guilt is assumed because there is no longer any way to challenge it. Letter from a Wapping resident, January 1812. It is whispered in the lanes that Williams may have been done away with by parties unknown, who feared what he might say in court. Blimey, there are few here who believe the rope was of his own making. Now, here is the revelation the history books glide past. Those initials carved into the mall, JP, were traced to John Peterson, the Swedish sailor who confirmed he had left the tool at the Pear Tree lodging house. Peterson was never seriously investigated as a suspect. He was simply the man who established the mall's provenance. But in 2011, 200 years after the murders, a historian reviewing the original magistrate's papers discovered something extraordinary. The mall's initials had been re-examined in 1812 by a second officer and recorded differently. He read them not as JP, but as IP. The same marks, the same handle, but a different letter entirely. The identification of the mall as rested on a single reading of ambiguous initial, taken in poor gaslight, by a man under enormous public pressure to produce a result. The connection between the mall and the Pear Tree lodging house, and therefore between the mall and John William, may have been built entirely on a mistake. Think about what that means. If the mall did not belong to Peterson, there is no chain of evidence linking it to the Pear Tree, no chain linking it to William. The entire investigation pivots on a single weapon, traced through initials that were never reliably confirmed, and the man they accuse is dead, and cannot speak for himself. When a man took his own life in Regency England, the law had a remedy. You could not hang him, but you could still degrade him. John Williams's body was loaded onto a cart and paraded through the streets of Wapping on the 2nd of January in 12, passing directly in front of the Marsh shop and the King's Arm. The cart stopped at each murder site. The crowd, thousands deep, followed in silence. At the crossroads of Cannon Street Road, the body was dumped into a hole and a stake was driven through the heart, the traditional treatment for a suicide, and a final act of condemnation for a man who had never been convicted of anything. Margait JWELL, giving testimony to the coroner's inquest, January 1812. I cannot say with certainty that I saw any man leave the premises. In December 1811, in the heart of London's most dangerous street, an entire family was bludgeoned to death in their own shop, and the man England hanged for it may never have committed a single one of the murders. 20 minutes past midnight, Saturday the 7th of December, 1811, a servant girl named Margaret Jewell stood outside a locked door, knocking. She'd only been gone 25 minutes, performing certainty it did not possess, because the truth was this: the investigation had been crippled from the start. No forensic science, no dedicated investigators, no national police force, just frightened men desperate to give the public something to fear that had a face and a name. They gave them John William. Whether he was guilty is a question 200 years on, remains genuinely open. His skeleton was unearthed during construction work on Cable Street in 1886. The skull was reportedly passed around as a curiosity. He had no monument, no grave marker, just a crossroads and a stake. The Ratcliff Highway murders changed England. Within 2 years, the first serious parliamentary debates about a professional, organized police force began. By 1829, Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Act passed into law. The men who would become the first constables were shaped, in part, by the memory of December 1811. the proof that a city without proper law was a city at the mercy of its own worst fears. But what the murders reveal, if you look long enough, is not just a failure of policing. It is a failure of patience. In the absence of certainty, London chose speed. The magistrates chose the appearance of competence over the reality, and a man, guilty or innocent, was buried at a crossroads with a stake through his chest because the city needed an ending more than it needed the truth. We still do this. The names and the century change. The pressure to name someone, anyone, and declare the matter closed does not. Every wrongful conviction in British legal history carries, somewhere in its bones, the same mechanism that put John Williams on that cart in January 1812. Fear, haste, and the unspoken instruction to be seen to act rather than to act rightly. 7 people died on Ratcliff Highway, a new gravel lane. Victorian Dark Mystery. A new investigation drops every week. And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different.